everyone. Welcome to what is an open session of my SUMA class, Writing About Global Science for the International Media. It's a class that I give in the spring and in the summer to teach graduate students in Columbia science programs about how to do science journalism. And there's another course in the fall about writing op-ed pieces. As you know, we hear a lot these days about the importance of great science communication, and there are even schools that are doing whole programs in science communication. But they needn't really go that far. It's not very complicated. All you have to do is want to tell a good story and tell it clearly and not make it too complicated. Explain the science, because sometimes people don't know about it, but it's not radioactive and it probably doesn't require a whole program. It requires will. But we have somebody here tonight who's really good at science communication. He is Neil Shubin, who is a University of Chicago paleontologist and biologist. And he is the author of 6 popular books. Some of them have been bestsellers. Now, Neil and I met many years ago when his first book, Your Inner Fish, was first published. And the book was about the discovery of a fossil of a prehistoric creature who is kind of the evolutionary mother of us all. This is the fossil of a fish who was one of the first fishes to sprout legs and then to walk on land. It was a fish that he called, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, Tiktaalik.
You got it.
Yay. And in finding the Tiktaalik fossil, Neil provided an important missing piece in the evolutionary puzzle. He showed how fins eventually became legs and gave rise to the many creatures who walk on Earth today, ourselves included. Shubin's first book, which did enormously well, was later translated into a highly successful PBS series, and he was the host of it. So this month, Dutton has published book number 6.
Book number 4.
I must have miscounted. I never was good at math. It's this book and it's that book. And it's kind of a funny hybrid book that's a mixture of science, tales from the field, and it's a kind of travelogue to the polar north and polar south. It's called Ends of the Earth, Journey to the Polar Regions in Search of Life, the Cosmos, and Our Future. So what we're going to do here tonight is I'm going to talk to Neil for about 45 minutes, Q&A style, and then we'll throw open the floor to questions. The front row, which are students from my class, will get first dibs, but some rules of the road first. We asked you to keep your questions simple, to ask actual questions, and to refrain from speechifying and only ask one question. That's a rule of interviewing. Never ask 2 questions in one question. So with these caveats, let's begin. Neil, over the years, in search of fossils and scientific understanding, you've made 25 trips to the polar north and south. You seem to particularly love that part of the world.
I do.
You do? Well, why?
I've had the great privilege of working in polar regions for almost 4 decades. I started when I was 3. Okay, so almost 4 decades. But these places have changed the way I see the world. And when you talk to the scientific community that has worked there, they will all say the same thing. It changes the way they see humanity, changes the way they see the planet, changes the way they see the cosmos because of the experiments that are done there. And it changes the way we see our relationship to the planet itself as well. But importantly, it also changed the way I see myself. You know, living in a tent at minus 20 degrees in a nylon tent, you learn things about yourself. I mean, not all of them are pretty, but you do learn things. You know, so it's been a real lens which I've been able to see the world.
Well, one of the things that I get in reading your book is that you think the polar regions are really very special places. Forgive my naivete, but aside from the fact that it's very cold, what is so special about it?
They are glorious to see. I mean, one of the places I work in East Greenland, it looks like the Navajo, the painted desert of northern Arizona, only had glaciers. Think of that juxtaposition. You know, imagine being at these places and being the first person to do the hike that you're doing, to walk these areas. I mean, that's special stuff. And then when you do this, you feel connected to the people who've lived here for thousands of years. You feel connected to the other people who've explored these areas or the general region over time. And these are all the inspirations, honestly, for the book.
So the new book, which is this stylistic hybrid, it's all about the joys of discovery, but it's also this kind of travelogue. It could be a travel book. How did the idea come to you to do this hybrid? By the way, Neil's editor is here, Emmy Award. Emmy, hi. She is the editor-in-chief of Dutton, and may I say, long ago, she was the editor of a book that I did, and I hope she won't be insulted. She was an assistant, and now she's the editor of a publishing house, and so that it's glorious to see how far she's traveled and how well earned it is. So welcome, Emmy. I'm sorry. I asked two questions.
Yeah. So you know, when you look at the subtitle of the book, I mean, that's big stuff. That's fairly epic, right? And it is an epic story in the sense that I'm traveling to the north and the south, and I wanted to tell it, at least initially, in a very personal way, but then to open up from the personal way to tell it through other people, to explorers who work there, other scientists who work there. So I'm sort of like your tour guide to there. It's a tour guide to these places, and so I introduce you to these places by taking you there, as I was on my first trip to Greenland, my first trip to Antarctica. Those are the first two chapters. But then after that, it opens up to the world of other scientists who've also had the privilege, like I have had, to work on the meteorites and the glaciers and just the life and the extraordinary things that exist in these very special places.
The book is full of tributes to things that we generally don't pay much attention to. For instance, it seemed to me to be a love poem to ice, the substance made of water. You're particularly fond of something called blue ice. What is so gorgeous about ice?
Ice is so surprising. You know, we're all used to thinking about ice in a glass or ice that we slip on the street. But when you think about ice the size of like the state of Florida, and when you think that ice that can be miles deep, it takes on properties that are surprising and sometimes confusing. We don't even understand it sometimes in these places. And ice, when you train to work in Antarctica, they lower you into a crevasse, which is one of these, you know, these are deep cracks in the ice that can be dangerous, and then the team pulls you out. But when you're in a crevasse, and when you see a crevasse, it's almost sacred. You're in a place that's blue because the way the light is absorbed by the water makes these different shades of blue. It takes different shapes that feel like you're in a Gothic cathedral almost, and it makes sounds. It makes sounds like thunder when it cracks. So you look down when you hear this thunderous boom, but you know, you look up when you hear this thunderous boom, but then you really should be looking down, you know, because it's this odd juxtaposition. And you know, when it moves slowly, it sounds like sizzling bacon. You know, so all these things about ice are so aesthetically pleasing. But then when you realize how important it is for our existence, that is that 80% or 70% of the fresh water of the planet is locked in the poles, then it means a lot for our lives today. So all those levels, ice is amazing.
So tell us about blue ice. What is it?
blue ice, so when you think about like several miles of ice, right? The top part is you get the snowfalls and the snowfalls each year, and it gets compacted over time. With each snowfall, with each passing year, it gets compacted. And then you add layers and layers and layers. Well, those deepest layers exist at higher pressures. And at that highest pressures, the ice becomes incredibly hard, like a rock that you could barely crack. And it's blue, and it's very slippery. And sometimes the ice is always moving in Antarctica and Greenland, always moving. And many times that ancient ice, which is blue, gets pushed to the surface. And so you'll see fields of this blue ice. And when you see that, it's beautiful, but it's dangerous because you just can't get purchase on it. It's extremely slippery. Crampons won't cut into it. So then when you see a hill of blue ice that slopes down, you know not to walk on it or take a snowmobile on it because you'll just go right down. There's nothing to stop you. It's frictionless. It's crazy the first time you see it, and it's scary the first time you walk on it.
What do you do to prepare yourself for these expeditions? Do you train?
Yes. A lot of it is spent on just the basics, how to live there, right? The food, getting people there, getting the right mindset, choosing the right crew or simpatico to these conditions. And then I'll do a lot of scientific training, obviously, preparing myself for the ice and the rocks, preparing myself about the history of scientific discovery in these places, preparing my body, which gets a little harder as you get a little older, but, trying to get, shape to do the climbs that are necessary. All that. I mean, so a typical preparation for a field season might take a year or a 4 to 8 week season. So it's a lot of prep to get the work done there.
You found Tiktaalik in Greenland.
In Ellesmere Island, which is across from Greenland.
Greenland's pretty hot in the news these days, to everyone's astonishment.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah. There's an old folk song, an Irish folk song called Greenland Whale Fisheries. And there's a line in it that says, Greenland is a dreadful place. It's a land that's never green. You don't see it that way at all.
No, it's the prettiest place I've ever worked. I mean, it's just gorgeous. I mean, again, as I set the image before, imagine seeing the mesas and buttes of Monument Valley, Arizona, or Arches National Park and pop some glaciers there, right? I mean, it's just a beautiful juxtaposition of landscapes. And then when you couple that with being a paleontologist and liking rocks that nobody has studied before for the fossils that may be weathering out, the times that I was there, honestly, I was like a kid in a candy store because you're walking these layers for the first time and bones are weathering out of the surface. So you'll be stopped and seeing bones, like any desert anywhere, that's how we find them. But in these areas, the weathering is very intense. And so you'll see trails of bone everywhere, of fossils weathering out of layers. And that's how we found Tiktaalik, honestly.
What do you think Donald Trump is up to when he says he wants to buy Greenland?
Well, let me tell you a story. It's not about Donald Trump. So if you were to remove the ice of the North Pole, pop it off, right? All you would see is ocean and sea floor, right? There's no continent there, it's ocean floor. Now there's a geological quirk that makes it very, very, very special. And it's going to be dominating the news in the next 5 to 10 years, trust me. There is a mountain range, mountain ridge, that runs about 1,000 miles from Siberia to Greenland and Canada, called the Lomonosov Ridge. And when you look at the geology of that ridge, they've done cores and so forth and sampled it, turns out that that ridge has rocks that aren't oceanic. They were formed on continents. And which continents were they formed on? Well, Greenland, Canada's Ellesmere Island, and Siberia, which means each of those countries, Russia, Denmark, and Canada, can claim an area 3 times the size of Texas as on the ocean floor below the North Pole as part of their own continental boundaries. Russia's already filed their claim. The Danes have already filed their claim. The Russian claim was approved by the UN Committee of Law of the Sea. The Canadians are about to file theirs. You have countries competing for the largest area remaining on the planet that's unclaimed. And think about with the warming that's happening, what's happening to those areas, they're now becoming accessible for oil and gas exploration, mineral exploitation, navigation routes, fisheries, you name it. And yeah, so that's kind of where it's heating up there in a lot of ways. Politically is not the least of it. And of course, the people who are in the middle of all this are the indigenous communities who live up there. Nobody's talking about them, but they're the ones who are in the middle of all this stuff.
There was a Danish television series a couple of years ago on Netflix called Borgen. And the second season of this series, it's about a woman who becomes the prime minister of Denmark twice. But the second season of this series is all about political struggles in Greenland and a lot of skullduggery. Do you think it's sort of odd and interesting that Greenland is becoming such a center of all these dramas?
Doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, Greenland's a real hot potato, and it's always been a hot potato. During the Cold War, the U.S. built military bases up there. In fact, they built one in the ice, Camp Century. And they were actually had planned to put missile silos in the ice of the glaciers of Greenland. You know, so it's always been, you know, a hot topic. It's just a hotter topic now because the Arctic is heating 4 to 7 times faster than anywhere else on the planet at the moment. You know, and that's because of a lot of things, the heating oceans and the albedo effect, loss of the albedo effect and so forth. And so, you know, that heating is increasing over time, and that's opening up vast areas, which are now, you know, ripe for political or geopolitical exploitation and controversy. So no, it doesn't surprise me at all. And, you know, you think about Greenland, it's all ice cap with some, you know, rock around the margins. I work on the coast of Greenland when I've worked there. Yeah, most of it's ice. And that we're losing about 280 gigatons of ice per year up there. That's up from 20 years ago. So.
Can you visibly see the changes in Greenland from the time you first went there to now?
Yeah, oh, definitely. So I can give you Ellesmere Island. Let me shift to Ellesmere because I was just there this past July. If you look at the aerial photos that the United States and the Canadians did in the late 50s, early 60s of the areas that we work on now, you could see large glaciers. When you look at the satellite photos that were taken, you know, 3 weeks before I left, you can now download them online. You see, you know, some of these glaciers have retreated 1/2 mile to a mile, exposing fossiliferous rock. So it's painful irony that what's bad for the planet and humanity is great for paleontology because we have more rock. But yeah, that's the real fact. Working in Antarctica, it's a little different because where I work in Antarctica is towards the center of the ice cap where the Transantarctic Mountains are. That's an area where actually the snow is increasing over time. The part of Antarctica that is most concerning, though, is the ice at the coast where the ice meets the warm waters of the ocean. And that's where it's retreating.
I read somewhere that you superimposed aerial photographs of Ellesmere the first time you visited on now, and it doesn't look like the same place.
Oh yeah, places I was camping on this summer were under ice, you know, in 1962, you know, so that's a vivid example of what's going on there. And that's just one part of the Arctic, you know, it just really is retreating fast. Yes.
So how much of your research is funded by the federal government?
I have been, so we funded the whole tiktaalik stuff was funded off of private foundations, National Geographic. Initially, it took us 6 years to find that fossil because you're working in the Arctic is not easy. So we had to go back and back and back and back. And so we failed for 5 years before finding it in the 6th. And we didn't have NSF, we didn't have government support then. It's only when we found it that we got government support. You need results to get the grants. So we had the results, then we got NSF support at that point. And then it was very generous. I have, you know, I fund my lab from lots of different sources, but federal is a big piece of it.
Well, what's going to happen to it?
Well, everything that has supported work is now under threat, right? I mean, we're talking about holding up NIH support, National Institutes of Health support for cancer. I just got a text yesterday. In fact, on Facebook, I found out a dear friend who worked for the U.S. Antarctic program for 25 years. And then shifted jobs, so was on probationary, see where I'm going, was on probationary status on the new gig, despite the fact that she's been there for 25 years, was summarily let go. And she found out about that as soon as the plane landed from Antarctica into New Zealand. And so what we're losing, and so 100 and I think 110 people were fired from the US Antarctic program just in the last week. And they were called probationary, but many of them had years of experience. They were only probationary because they shifted into a new position. So we're losing just enormous amounts of expertise that will, and this expertise is vital for, supporting the work of the scientists who are there, supporting the lives of the scientists who are there. It's very specialized knowledge, takes specialized knowledge and dedicated people, and that just can't be reinvented immediately, and so we're really losing their precious human resources. And not only that, the funding for the science itself is at risk. So no, these are perilous times.
Well, the cuts that we've seen in science in the last 2 weeks, to what degree do you feel that they were possible because the scientific community has not really built a big base of support for its efforts?
Well, I mean, when you look at the causes of what we're in right now, there's so many causes for anything that's sort of tectonic like this. I think COVID is a big piece of that. I think the response to COVID, I think the people's interpretation of COVID, the stories people tell themselves about COVID, what they treat as fact, but are really in reality stories. I think that's a piece of it, and are accusing science of different things. I think, science is part of an elite. We're living in an anti-elite age. I mean, there's lots of causes here, I think. But I think, at the end of the day, what we have to do as working scientists is communicate better what we do. Is that guaranteed to work? No, but we have to do it. And, you just see the misunderstandings that are on Twitter or in social media, or even in the news. And I think a lot of that is because people are painting their own stories on complex phenomena. And I think it's important on scientists to give their stories. And I think we need to be energized around that. And that's certainly what we're talking to. I'm in a medical school, and that's certainly what we're talking to our students and postdocs about, running seminars and workshops on scientific communication, kind of like this.
Well, you're unusually successful at telling a scientific story to the public, and you've developed a public, and anyone could read your books and get what you're talking about.
I hope.
Well, I would say that tell us some of your secrets of how you do that.
Well, first off, I was really lucky to have the Tiktaalik story, right? Which is, we designed an expedition to find a fish with arms and legs inside a fin, gills and lungs and all that. And we worked really hard in the Arctic. We made a prediction. It took us 6 years, but we found it. And so I can tell the human part of that story. I can tell the scientific part of that story. But then I end with, hey, look what the understanding evolution and geology can do. And here's the fish with arms. And when I speak to a creationist audience, which I do, I tell that story, and I end the story by bringing a cast of the fish. And you see the humerus, you see the radius and ulna, you see the fish does the talking for me. I do the talking of about the discovery story. That's a sweet spot to be in, right? And so I use that as an example, but I look for stories. I look for stories that when we think about how we remember facts, how we organize facts, how we feel about those facts, they're all in the narratives we tell other people and tell ourselves. We're always telling ourselves stories, right? About the past, present, and future. We're telling each other stories, and that's how our facts are linked. And science is no different. And so I love a good story. And, I was raised in a family which loved good stories. And
Tell about your father.
My father was a noir fiction writer in the 50s and 60s, punchy in the gut, that kind of Marlowe, Sam Spade. I have a friend from elementary school here. He remembers my dad typing upstairs. And that's how he supported the family. And my dad used to give me his manuscripts before he sent them off to the publisher or his editor. And I learned a couple things. One is never criticize an author. So I would always say, like, Dad, this is perfect, but you can make it perfect-er if you, did X, Y, and Z. But there were certain forms of the story that I really, particularly that kind of storytelling, that meant a lot to me. And that was, it moved fast, it kept your attention all the time. It was surprising. You thought you understood it, you thought you were following the story, then take you in a different direction. Had cliffhangers, both at the end of paragraphs or at the end of sections. Now, science doesn't always lend itself to that kind of storytelling, but boy, when it does, yeah, I'm all in, you know. So that's kind of what I look for.
If you had a list of do's and don'ts you would to advise would-be science writers, what would they be?
I think the key thing about science writing that doesn't get talked about a lot, or as much as it should, is I think the important variable is authenticity, being authentic. And I think, you know, it's easy to tell a story, but you want that story to have authenticity to it. And it's because it's authenticity that resonates with people. They're going to listen to you. They're going to believe you. If they feel you're objective, if you're telling stories and you're telling stories about yourself where you're imperfect, and you talk about it, I mean, there's just ways to do it, I think, that build authenticity. And I think that's really important. I think jargon is not something I typically will put in my writing. When I do it, it's with a reason. And here's the problem. Jargon works very well because it's incredibly precise. The terms have history to them. They have lots of meaning to them, cultural meaning and so forth. But once you go, but the problem is with jargon, sometimes science writing can become like a language lesson rather than lesson in how we do science and the concepts and so forth. So I try to focus on concepts and discovery stories rather than the language of science. The problem is when you lose jargon, it's like you're on a tightrope without a net. It's easy to fatal. So, you know, you have to find analogies and find other ways to describe complex things. So I try to tone down jargon. I can't avoid it always, but I do try to tone it down. I read my stories with an eye towards authenticity. Does it feel legit? Do I bring the legitimate feelings and insights I've had as a working scientist to the page in a way that matters to the reader? You know, those sorts of things. I don't always write to those. I edit to myself to them. I write any way I want. I just write crazy stuff, and then I'll edit, you know.
So what we do in my class is say, it's okay for you to write like a scientist for a scientific paper, but forget about those forms when you're writing for the public because they don't translate well.
Oh, indeed. Well, the thing is, writing a scientific paper is like, which I write a lot of, and you know, it's a dance with well-scripted, you know, moves and steps, right? You have an introduction, you have the, you know, materials and methods, results, and, you know, figures, figure captions. It's kind of well thought out. And I remember I sold Your Inner Fish as a proposal, which was basically a single page with a pitch letter and an outline, not even a sample chapter. And it went through, and I was like so happy that it, you know, I have a book contract, and it was Your Inner Fish. The title was great. I loved it. And I sat down. I remember the first weeks I sat down to the blank screen, and I'm like, oh, now I got to write this thing. And and I remember feeling I felt free. I felt like, I felt liberated in a way that really accuracy, entertainment. I wanted the pages to turn themselves. I want to be informative. I want to share the stories about being a working scientist and discovering and sometimes not discovering, you know, and what goes on in that. And I remember feeling very liberated when I did that. And, you know, so I played with different styles, but it took me a while to find my voice. But, you know, and finding a lot of fun, honestly, finding my voice meant having confidence in myself as a writer, which took a little while to develop.
It took a while?
Yeah, definitely.
What?
I don't know. I felt imposter syndrome, you know, sort of writing, and because I was, this is a new gig of my writing, and I'm like, is this any good? And I'd give it to my wife, and she'd say, no, it sucks. I'm like, oh, great. And, you know, so then I'd start to do it again. And yeah, it took a while to get the confidence that what I was doing was legitimate on the page. Because and it took me a while to find my voice, honestly. And then what lowered the bar for me, honestly, was a little trick I had in my head, was my father was a writer, but he was very science focused. Computer, like behind the screen of the computer. And I kept it, so I developed a very conversational style doing that. Like I'm telling Dad about how we found Tiktaalik, you know? And it just flowed onto the page that way. Now, obviously it was kind of lousy. I had to edit myself to it, but at least it got me going in a rough draft that had a voice that I could edit myself to, you know? And it felt natural. It felt authentic to me.
Well, on that note, let's throw this out to the floor and hear your questions to Neil Shubin about what he does and how he does it. Anna, are you around with the microphone? This is Anna Matson, who is the assistant teacher in the class, and she is herself a science journalist and a graduate of the science program at the J School. So she has the microphone, and she will play Oprah here and bring it round.
And if there are no questions, I'll just tell stories.
Yeah. Well,
I have a question. I wonder, did you ever teach a non-majors course for an undergraduate? Because that's what I did. I taught an environmental issues class for non-major undergrads, and that gave me an experience that I have used ever since, talking to politicians,
Absolutely.
writing books for the general public. I think that was a really good, I mean, a lot of people in my department didn't want to teach this course, you know. They wanted to teach seniors and grad students. But this was a really good way for, I tell us, for any young people here who are, let's say, in graduate school or working as academics. If you want to do that, teaching a non-majors course is a good way to learn it.
Yeah, so to answer the question, and yes, I do. I teach one right now at University of Chicago. It's called the Human Body in Deep Time, Your Inner Fish. But you know, I love your point, because before I wrote Inner Fish, before I even thought of writing the book for Inner Fish, I was really, at the time I was suffering, but now I look back on it, I was really lucky, because I was teaching human anatomy to medical students, which is all in dissecting cadavers, you know, working really hard in the classroom with medical year one medical students. But I was also provost of the Field Museum. So in the Field Museum, which is a natural history museum, I'd be telling, you know, kids who visited, I'd say, hey kids, you know, do you know that your jaw was once a gill bone of a fish? And they go, no. And then I talk to the trustees. I say, hey, you know, your jaw, our human dentary bone, was formerly a gill bone of a chondrichthyon or osteichthyon. And they'd be like, really? I say, yes. And then I was teaching it in medical school. So I was doing the same story to different audiences. So that was the wellspring, so that when I was writing Inner Fish, I had those stories that worked at different multiple levels, and I can extract the kernel of the piece that I thought worked best. But it was the non-major stuff, then talking to the kids was actually huge.
so Regina Valdez.
Thank you. Hi, Neil. It's really great that you're here, and I really appreciate it. I have a question. I hope that's okay. I'm an aspiring science writer, and but I don't have the prolific science background as you do. And so some of the ways that I've looked to write is from like personal experience or a springboard from another story. For example, a few years ago, I read an article in the Times about like these dinosaur footprints that were found in Texas that hadn't been seen. You know, it was like the first time they were discovered. And I was like, that sparked an idea. I was like, well, this is the legacy of dinosaurs. What will be ours? And then also, I'm wondering, for someone who doesn't have a science background, as you, I mean, first is, are those two ways legitimate? And then the last question, are there sources for us to like find information? Like, are there stories breaking over the AP wires or something like that you might recommend to an aspiring science writer?
Yeah, so the answer is yes to your first question, and to the second, yeah, the wires are great. So I had this gig in Chicago for a period of time where for our local Chicago PBS affiliate, there was an hour-long news show, and I was like Mr. Science for one Like one day a month, I'd go on camera and talk about science. It was called Scientific Chicago. And the things that would come over would be like physical science experiments from the national laboratories, like neutrino experiments, stuff I was like you. I mean, this is stuff that you would cover, but I was like you in the sense that I was not expert in it and I didn't even understand it. So I would call the people and I'd get their stories. And I'd get their stories and try to tell their stories. It would still be stories, but I was telling it through telling somebody else's stories in those cases. And also, sometimes my struggles with understanding some of this material gave me insights into ways I could communicate to other people. What didn't understand? What were the hurdles for me in understanding this material? And what are the ways that I could generalize it in a way to a much broader audience? Does that help?
That was really, really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Maxim,
Yeah, so I think in general, when we're thinking about the polar regions, there's a lot of dread now about, the climate or politics. So I really wanted to follow up with what you were saying about, as a paleontologist, it's kind of interesting the opportunities that'll come up as the ice melts. Do you have a short list of maybe like links in Earth's evolutionary tree that like you would be excited about people potentially being able to discover down the line, as you did with Tiktaalik?
Yeah, hugely. So in Antarctica is a continent, right? So if you remove the ice of Antarctica, it's a continent with mountains, right? And there are lakes under the ice, by the way. Pretty crazy, but that's true. But anyway, the mountains poke through the ice. So it's literally the tip of the iceberg. The ice could be, 2 to 3 miles thick, but then you have these mountains poking through. And so those mountains, known as the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, cut across Antarctica, and they have rocks of all kinds of different geological ages. My team was working on rocks that were about 380 million years old, but I would love to work on rocks there are rocks there that were formed in sort of ancient oceans on the near shore areas, the tidal flats of ancient oceans that are almost 500 million years old. And they look to me to be perfect to find the earliest vertebrates, the earliest fish, deeper in time, like a major event where we really don't have a ton of great fossils. There are some, but they're not great. And so, yeah, if I had a magic wand, that would be the sort of thing I would do. But you have essentially on East Greenland, and the coast of Greenland on East Greenland, it's rocky, it's cliffs, maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet of rock. And it's basically a staircase through time. As you go north, you go into more ancient rocks. And some of those rocks, as you go far north, contain some of the oldest evidence of some of the oldest life on the planet. So you have a whole record that can conceivably be, mined, or not mined, but quarried or studied for evidence of, key transitions in the history of life. And it would be fabulous. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
So,
Nicholas.
thank you. So a follow-up on that is, of course, your field is benefiting out of the melt of the ice. I guess something that is happening is that climate change is going to benefit different areas of the world as they become, well, their climate or the weathers become better. How do you reconcile that you're benefiting from a damaging situation?
Well, it's a tragic irony. That's the way I present it, I'm not happy about it, but it is what it is. And, when you think about what's happening in these regions, I get sad. In 1988, I went with a 4-person crew. They're no longer alive. But so much of the ice we walked on as a crew is no longer around. That's all disappeared. I don't feel good about that. I have an emotional connection to these landscapes. One thing that drove this was I love these places and I'm connected to these landscapes. They've taught me so much about the world and myself and everything, And so when I see the changes, it's it hurts. It's not a happy thing. So no, does that answer your question? Because it's definitely not I'm not jumping up and down for joy that I can find new fossils on these, I mean, we're there and we're doing it, but it feels like a loss personally to somebody who's been there for almost 4 decades, and when you think about how we're all going to be, that fresh water that enters the ocean changes so much, not only sea levels, but ocean currents, which move heat around the planet. weather patterns that result from that. I mean, there's just so much that we're connected to ice in so many ways. We take them all for granted. And part of it is I wanted to reveal in this book that ice is a silent partner in our lives. We don't see it. We live around here, but the world we're in has been defined by ice. And the loss of it is going to define our future. And that was kind of the spirit of the book, having been connected to these landscapes in the way as a scientist who's worked there.
Could the questioners say their names first, so that we know
Hi.
who you are? Hi.
Callie Stiles. I'm actually in Professor Dreifus's class now. And I started reading your book, or actually listening to it. It's available on Spotify if anyone's like me and likes audiobooks. And similar to what my other classmates here are asking you about the benefits, I'm curious on the other side. I know you touched a little bit about climate change and what that means. And in the book, you mention with the melting of the ice reveals potential diseases and things that are coming up, right? That if they find a nearby host and it could be the next COVID pandemic, essentially. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, like what the risk looks like. Is that something we should be concerned about in New York City? And are there other potential risks that you are seeing, again, with the melting of these ice and glaciers? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So the ice, as it melts, creates risks for our future in several ways. Environmental risks, health risks, and geopolitical risks. All of those. Geopolitical, I already talked about. That is, a lot of the international relations and the land territories have been based on, people not caring as much about the area. Now they care a lot, and so they're going to be tussling over the north. Likewise, Antarctica has profited from having a treaty, which has kept it international. Well, all it takes is one U.S. president to change that, right? And because it's since 1961, it's not been militarized, or there's not been nuclear work there, but who knows how that will be. In terms of the ice itself and the threats of melting ice, there was a team so we know a little bit, but not a lot. So there was a Canadian team from Ottawa that worked on the melting ice up in a place called Lake Hazen, which is in northern Ellesmere Island, across from Greenland. It's kind of maybe 150 miles from the ice cap itself. And they were looking at a melting glacier, and they would sample the waters, and they can apply to those waters. They can sample the DNA in the waters and the RNA. They can sample all the nucleic acids and stuff. And you can get a snapshot of every microbe that lives in there. And they found an enormous number of viruses in there. And so when they looked at the sequences of those viruses, they're the kinds that can infect the local fauna, And so certainly there are microbes being released by melting ice, and that can be released by melting ice. You couple that with the fact that with the changes in the Arctic, creatures that normally had their ranges in the south are moving north. Now there's going to be more exposure to those viruses just as they are melting out of the ice. Now, the real question here is how much of a threat are they to us? And so far, they don't look like any, kind of known threat. There are many viruses that infect us, most of them benign. And none of them look horrible yet. But there are some stories here that are concerning. So a virus was found in ice that was dated to around 50,000 years. And that virus was able to be reanimated to be able to infect an amoeba. So they can withstand long periods of time in ice. And there are an enormous number of viruses. So it's not a threat to be sanguine about, but it's not one that I would perceive as necessarily urgent, because there's nothing on the epidemiological landscape, the virological landscape, that suggests there's something, an emergent threat that's coming out of that area. But it certainly could happen. The threats that I think about most are our world, as I said, ice is our silent partner. Coastlines, Pacific islands, weather patterns, agricultural belts. We take for granted how much our world has been defined by ice. Not only our evolutionary history as a species, ice ages and so forth, but ice really has shaped our world. And as that changes, it's going to change how we interact with the planet. But part of that is it's going to change, as I said before, is how we interact with each other as nation states. And that's where I worry a lot.
Did I see some questions in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm going to stand because I can't see you when I'm sitting. I'm Thayer Kennedy. I'm also a student in Claudia Dreifus's class. So you are a paleontologist by training, and a lot of your work has patched holes in our evolutionary understanding. But throughout this interview, you've used a lot of words that are deeply emotional, and some of which are really religious. Like you talked about going down a crevasse and you called it sacred. And we live in a time where those two things, emotional, religious, and then science, are at opposition of one another. And I'm curious if you can speak to the intersection of the two and the constantly changing rhetoric in the time that we live in right now.
Yeah, I'm not just using spiritual words. I feel a connection to this planet that borders on spiritual. You know, there is a passion and a love and a appreciation that runs really deep. And these regions bring it out of me, having lived in them, you know, in a very intimate way in a tent, in, you know, harsh conditions, and, you know, and learning so much about myself that the connection is, you know, when you is spiritual in a way, because when you talk to people who've been lowered in a crevasse, they always use the cathedral analogy. They always use a hallowed space. You're in this space that no other human has been before. It's hallowed by the fact that nobody else has been there, that it's deadly. You know, it has this real feel to it. And then you feel like you're returning to the world when you're pulled out of the crevasse. You know, so I, as a paleontologist, there are, and a natural historian, I'm also a molecular biologist, where my lab does a lot of DNA work. There's a deep aesthetic to what I do, and there's a deep aesthetic to science. It has its beauty. It has an awe that is inspiring. It can also be scary and dangerous. It has all the things that sprout from awe, right? And working in these places just puts me in that zone. Yeah, so I can't speak for others about the separation, but for me, there's kind of really not. It's a really sort of a landscapes bring that awe in me. You know, just like, you know, I mean, it's just like the awe you feel when you are, when we saw Tiktaalik for the first time in the rocks. You know, we're seeing this moment in evolutionary history. We're the first humans to see that. And all scientists share that moment. No matter what they're doing, they're the first person to see something for the first time. And there's a moment of discovery. You're at the tip of human knowledge. There's an aesthetic to that. So I'm merging spirituality and aesthetics, but to me, they're kind of all part of the same spectrum.
Kate, gentleman there, and then Kate.
Hi, I'm Marco Tedesco. I'm a researcher here, and I study ice. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for the question. I wanted to follow up with you, connecting to the question that was just asked. Do you interact with the indigenous population? What is your interaction with them, and what is your perception about how they are engaged in the co-production and the engagement also of sharing the final results?
Yes,
about how much they contribute to that.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So we started our work up in Ellesmere Island, which is Nunavut territory. When Nunavut, which is the Inuit territory, was founded. And as part of that, we had to work with the Inuit to get permission, the local Inuit to get permission to work in these areas. And we developed a relationship with them over time. There's a town called, a hamlet called Grise Fjord, which is the northernmost human settlement, non-military human settlement in the world. It's about 81 north. It has a fraught history. I'll tell you that in a second. Talk about it in the book, but it's fraught. And we got to know those people. There's 175 people. It's about 300 miles from our fossil sites. So when we discovered the fish, we said, you know, and we had Inuit youth with us that would show up as part of our expedition. They'd show up from the town. It was wonderful for the crew, wonderful for them, I hope. We had a naming project for the fossil. We said, you know, what'd you guys call this? And so we described, you know, we're working the rocks. It's a fish with arms and legs. And we had to work with them a bit to say, look, you know, we want a name that's meaningful to us and meaningful to you. And they came up with the name Tiktaalik. It was their word. And so when we published the papers on it, they appeared, there were a couple papers that appeared back to back in a big major scientific journal. We sent lesson plans and casts of the fish and to the town. And we worked with the teacher to develop, because she's in a one-room schoolhouse, which has everything from, 6-year-olds all the way to high school. And it's a rotating position. So we worked with them on, how to include that in their curriculum. And it was so rewarding for me to come back a number of years later and to see the cast of Tiktaalik that we sent them, which is here in the American Museum of Natural History, but it's in their school, this little schoolhouse. Yeah, so we formed relationships with them. And they've been part of the expeditionary teams over the years. And Grise Fjord is actually, the story there is so fraught because there's 175 Inuit there that are about originally 4 families, but they were originally, up until about 1953, living in northern Quebec. And they were promised, they were moved by the Canadian government to this area in Ellesmere Island for political reasons, because the Canadians realized they needed a human settlement up there to justify their claim to the island. So they moved 4 families up there, telling them that, oh, the hunt will be better. You're going to have muskox and polar bears, love it. And by the way, if you don't like it, we're going to, after 2 years, bring you home. None of that happened, And I had the great privilege of meeting, talking to an individual who was actually one of the kids who was moved up there. And now he's an older man, and he wrote a book about the experience. And his book really profoundly affected me. And I had a chance of developing a relationship with him, and I saw him this past summer, Larry Odlaluk. And his story is just so wrenching, because they were affected in several ways. First of all, these are mostly nomadic peoples that were forced to be sedentary, in one area. And then they were moved to, almost 1,000 miles north into a place where none of their cultural practices really applied. They would pick berries and they'd hunt birds, and now they're in a very, barren place, and they're very dependent on government support. And they resent that. And they have all the challenges you can imagine of being a small community isolated from the rest. And so they call the big city in the south Iqaluit, which is 1,500 miles to the south, but that's itself a small Inuit town. So no, I mean we've had significant interactions with them, and we found some stuff this past summer, and trying to find some students to include on the scientific research for the actual lab research of the paper. So we're working on that right now. So maybe have some visitors coming down from Grise Fjord to my lab in Chicago to work with us for some of this.
And before we get to Kate's question, I'm curious if you ever think about the previous generations of explorers who went to the places you go to. For instance, do you think about Amundsen, who also hit? Yeah, what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a big story in the book, but I could have told many more. There are many that didn't make the cut in the book. But I'm very connected to those explorers in many ways. And the one that really, I think, affected me emotionally the most in writing the book was Robert Falcon Scott, who is considered to be a total failure, who made the push for the pole, competing against Amundsen. When his team got to the pole, now remember, the pole's at 9,500 feet. It's up there, it's high altitude. And you're at the pole, so it's super cold, super windy, super dry, right? And it's a haul to get there. They had a man-haul sledges hundreds of miles up 9,000 feet to the South Pole. His team gets there, about 6 people. They find Norwegian tents there. They've been beaten to the pole. Scott, they turn around, beaten, and they die 6 weeks later, exposed to the elements. And everybody says, well, Scott, Amundsen was the pro. He adopted Inuit technologies and techniques, which is true. Made a run for the pole, beat him, and Scott has been considered a failure who sort of brought about his own failure through arrogance and failure to prepare. And part of that is indeed true. But one thing that was lost that I had the privilege of looking at their notes at the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge, where a lot of these original things are, and I was going through notes. And the one thing that affected me profoundly is, and this tells the story, is they died. 3 of them, all 6 died. One of them died. His leg got hobbled, and he's sitting in the tent with his others. And this is 2 weeks before the others died and passed away. And he's looking at looked outside the tent and says, I'm gonna go outside. I might be some time. Walked out to die because he knew he was holding his team back. Oates, Lieutenant Oates. Anyway, so they bring back, their bodies, and so I'm sorry, the rescue team comes 6 months later, because it takes a while to get there. Comes 6 months later, finds the 3 bodies in the tent of the remaining crew. Scott is, hugging his corpse, his arms around his teammates. They died of exposure. What was next to their tent? They couldn't carry. They ran out of food. They ran out of energy, supplies, everything. 60 pounds of fossils that they collected on the way back from the South Pole. Desperate, knowing they stood a good chance of dying, they stopped to collect fossils, and they carried them to the very end. And not only that were they fossils, but they were fossils of a plant known as Glossopteris from the Triassic era, which is also, they're present, these fossils, they found the first examples from Antarctica, but they're also known from Australia, South America, and Africa, evidence for continental drift. So think about that, science to the very end, I mean, those are the stories that I'm writing them. I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, tears are coming out of my eyes as I'm writing it, as I'm reading about it. It was, and that's just one of many. I mean, that's kind of when you see there's all kinds of stories there: tragedy, poisoning, murder, heroism, serendipity, unbelievable skill, leadership, failure to lead. I mean, just there's human stories everywhere there, and all about discovery and science.
Kate, you had a question.
And I also have a brother who has dedicated his life to studying glacial retreat in Greenland. I'm Danish, so he's been there, and he echoes a lot of your sentiments about the ice and the beauty and just the juxtaposition of the landscapes. So you talked a lot about the importance of authenticity when crafting a compelling narrative. And I was just curious to know how you think about empathy in the context of science communication, and more specifically, how you're able to find the balance between empathy and authenticity with being persuasive.
I don't think empathy is opposed to authenticity. In fact, I think in some cases, it's part of it. And I mean, when you talk about empathy, I mean, empathy to several things is first. Empathy to the subjects, which is big. I mean, so when I was writing about Larry Odlaluk, the Inuit individual, or Oates, it's hard not to feel that empathy, right? But there's also, I mean, I think you need to think about empathy with one's subjects, but also empathy for the reader. In a lot of ways. They're busy. Yeah, and sometimes you're telling very difficult material. People die, so you have to be empathetic in how you do that. And you have to be all true to yourself as well. But I mean, I don't find it a big, I guess, I don't find them opposed to one another, authenticity or
I meant like authenticity and empathy being one group, and then persuasion in the science community being another, and those sort of being seen as opposed, right?
They
When you
are
bring in feelings and when you're describing scientific material.
Like there'll be times when I'm writing, right? And I'm like, oh, this is great. This is the best. This is the absolute best. And I'm writing it. And then I'll read it like 3 days later. It's like, and it's awful. And largely the region is because I'm trying to persuade too much, because it pops me out of my zone, And so if I turn off the persuasion piece and go deep inside myself, which is, why do I love this stuff? What were my struggles in terms of understanding this material? What are my concerns? What are my fears? What are my hopes? All that. When I look inside myself, then I get more true to that authenticity. I can find that authentic place. Where I'm trying to persuade, that's when I'm out of my zone. It may be the best prose in the world, but it's not where I want to be. And so, yeah, a lot of you know, and so it has to be, I don't try to, I don't write trying to persuade, right? I write trying to tell a story. And I want to persuade, but I rarely tell people, like for instance, Inner Fish was a book about evolution and common descent, but I never mentioned evolution once in that book, the word. I wasn't trying to persuade, I was trying to tell the story because I felt if I stayed true to this story, it will persuade. But there's integrity to the story I'm telling. And so it means having confidence in your story and being true to your story. And then you'll find yourself, if you want to be true to your story, you're going to, I think, and if it's a good one, you'll find yourself being authentic because you're true to yourself, but you'll also find yourself being persuasive by extension. I think, I hope. Sometimes, not always, but you know, if you're in that sweet spot, definitely.
Did I see some questions in the back? Yeah.
Hi. This is kind of loud. Okay. My name is Danny. So I had kind of maybe a bit of a rambly question for you, but it's about science communication. I feel like academic writing, science communication in general, can be like very inaccessible even to like other academics. Maybe a controversial statement. But I don't know, at what level, I also teach actually non-majors environmental science, also very coincidentally. And I feel that some people, you know, it's like kind of a big task to like want to get people who are business majors or whatever to care, you know, or to like really engage with the material. And I was just kind of wondering, at what level do you think is it best to engage with an audience? Because I feel like there is sort of like, you know, there are a lot of people who care about Nat Geo, right? Like reading Nat Geo, et cetera. But I feel like there is a whole other sect of folks who, you know, don't really even think about like wanting to read National Geographic. And I don't think it's because like they're just fundamentally disinterested in science. I think it's more, you know, because that sort of love for science has not really been nurtured, perhaps, or whatever, right? Like, but yeah, at what level do you think? It's kind of like, it's a difficult question because like, you know, one wants to like make science writing more accessible and like, you know, also make that sort of one's research, whatever, more accessible to, you know, people at all levels of their like academic journey or whatever. But
Right.
what level do you think is like best to sort of break into? Ideally, right, it would be like fundamentally, right? You nurture that sort of love for science
Yeah, that's a
as
good
early as
question.
possible.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, let me think about the response because I actually, when I write, I'm not thinking about level as much as I am the story. Does it make sense? Does it have universals in it that people can connect with? Human universals or intellectual universals or aesthetic universals? I mean, at different levels. Can people connect with this story? Can people connect with this science? And you know, I have scientific goals when I write. I don't start just, I'm going to tell any story. I have a goal in mind of what science I want out there, you know, and then the narrative path I work on a bit to find. But it's funny, I'm not thinking the level. I was just thinking of your question. I'm not really thinking, oh, I'm going to go for 9th grade level or, you know, college student level or whatever. I'm really trying to find universals. It was kind of like when I was answering the question that you asked, where it was like I was privileged to talk to kids and trustees and medical students, that there were certain universals to those stories that were general. It was kind of level independent in a way. Yeah, sure, there's level in there. There's, you know, could be big words there, but and maybe challenging concepts or challenging stories. But yeah, I'm thinking more of generality of universals, right? And that's kind of there are universals to good stories. There really are.
Yeah, may I chime in on that? I think science writing has been too mystified. It's a topic like any other. And if you treat it as not being radioactive, but rather as a human endeavor done by humans, where some of the material is unfamiliar to the reader, because we're not a very science literate society, and you may have to explain some concepts, but it's a story like any other. And once you demystify it and take it off this high pillar that a lot of people put it on, then it's easy to tell. It's a good story. Almost every science story that when I did science interviews for the New York Times, they all had a very similar arc that ended with discovery. That was the denouement of each one of these interviews. Discovery is interesting. How you got there is interesting. It's interesting to everyone. But one of the things we have to do is, and maybe de-academize science writing a little bit, if there is such a word. One of the things we have to do is just say, hey, this is a good story. I think Neil Shubin is one of the people who's done this very well. We have another person here who, if he doesn't mind my introducing him, my first editor at Science Times, Dennis Overby, who covers the universe or the cosmos, a topic even more difficult for people to take in than frozen places.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of cosmos in the frozen places, like they study
Yeah.
neutrinos and Hubble telescope and stuff.
Dennis, what are the parallels between what you do and what Neil does?
I mean, my own point, I'm just always looking for a good story. And I think, I don't think it's my job to teach anybody science, but I think it's to teach them a good story about something that it's our story that we're all part of. And so that's how I go about doing it. And I think the universe is something we're all part of. It's our story. And so, I mean, I agree with everything you said.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your question. I was just thinking, you know, if I don't want science to feel like the medicine and my story to feel like the sugar that goes down with the medicine. If that's how it is, I've failed you, right? I haven't found the right story, right? That's kind of what, if you could say, oh yeah, thank you. I gulped down that awful tasting stuff because the sugar all around it was kind of sweet. That's not what I want. You know, it's the story has to have an integrity and authenticity and empathy and all that stuff. And then it has to tell the science in a good way.
Dennis has one more point to make.
Yeah, the other thing that has always struck me is that science is kind of an unexplored part of our culture. And so there's lots of rich stories in there and I think I used to say that scientists don't leave themselves behind when they go in the lab. It's in the lab in which they actually become who they really are. And it's just a fascinating realm of human endeavor to explore.
Indeed.
Okay, we'll take. So you have a question.
I actually do have a question. Hi, Neil. It's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for coming. I come from a very story-forward background. I have a very heavy focus in journalism, and science just happens to be the thing that I love to write about. And so I'm really curious, from your perspective as someone who comes from such a heavy science background, do you have any suggestions or input of how to better think like a scientist?
How to better think like a scientist. Well, there are different ways that scientists think. You know, so as a my lab is one example. So I have molecular biology in my lab. We do a lot of DNA work and paleontology. And actually the way that the empirical approach and the way they ask questions in my lab and the different parts of my lab can sometimes be very different, you know, but I think fundamentally it comes down to, you know, finding evidence in some important way. And it really does come down to evidence and how you collect that evidence and how you make sense of that evidence and how you evaluate that evidence and how that evidence relates to your own thinking. And so the different flavors of science in my own lab and or in the departments that I've been fortunate to be part of, it always comes down to that evidence-based piece. And I think in terms of thinking like a scientist really comes down to making arguments that have evidence around them that is comprehensible, but it can also, I think, move hypotheses forward, move ideas forward in a big way. I mean, sometimes we have our data before we make our hypotheses, It's just kind of how it is sometimes. But it really does come down to evaluating evidence, finding evidence, is evidence in different flavors, in different flavors.
Thank you.
So let's get some questions from people who haven't asked, and we're almost at the end of our time. The gentleman there and the gentleman there.
So Paul was you're a professor here, and he was one of my first collaborators when I was a graduate student.
Yeah.
You were just a new faculty
Back in the
member here.
Pleistocene.
Yeah, way back in the day.
So, Neil and I worked together back in the 80s, and I knew him when he was a graduate student at Harvard, and we worked together a lot. And I have a question for you, Neil, that comes out of my graduate students and discussions with them. And we talk a lot about the view of quite a substantial part of the US of anti-elitism and extreme suspicion of science. And you mentioned that. And I think you also mentioned part of the answer to what I'm going to ask. So the question is fundamentally, many of the science stories of the last 50 years have been environmental science stories. And in those, there's been a more or less constant drumbeat of negativity. Not only are we heading into disaster, but it's your fault, and you're going to have to change your ways in order to do something about it. Now, to take some inspiration from Saturday Night Live, nobody wants Debbie Downer at the dinner table.
No, that's right.
And so how would you and how do you approach making accessible the ways of thinking that allow problems to be approached in ways that are not personally threatening to so many of those people? Because they just turn it off and they're not going to read it.
No, that's right. If you come in and you tell folks, oh, well, we're going to see 15 feet of sea level rise in the next 200 years, they will tune you off. I mean, in my field in evolution, it's the same way. If I come into a creationist crowd and say, you have creationism here and you have evolution here, we have all this evidence, you have none, you're done. That's not the way you talk to people. I think you need to meet people where they are. And so there's probably not one strategy if you're talking different crowds. So for evolution, for instance, I go into the Tiktaalik story if I'm in a creationist group. As I told you, here's the prediction we made, here's what we did, tell them stories about the Arctic. Oh, by the way, here's Tiktaalik, it's got the arms just like we thought it would have, that kind of thing. But climate change is a little different because it is threatening, and people have to ideally you want people to make different choices in their lives based on the science that you're telling them. But I think, and I don't have the answers here. Okay, let me just tell you what my feeling is, but there's probably 30 other opinions that are probably equally valid as what I'm going to tell you. I felt, particularly when I was writing this book, that if you can be an exemplar of somebody who has experience in a landscape, passion for a landscape, and you're witnessing changes in that landscape, in a landscape that's very special to you, and if you can connect and communicate with people around that, maybe they can own that as well. It's not telling them that the world's collapsing. It's basically here's something that's precious, that's changing, and that we have the power not to change it. That we have power in what we do. That it's not all one way necessarily. That it can be, if we act, we can change. But you have to always realize too that there's always going to be people who are never going to get your message, right? You have to know your audience. Yeah, I mean, it could be, I think, it's probably closer to 35 or 40 for some of these things. But, I think, there's going to be an intractable part of that population that you're not going to be able to convince. But I always said, it's funny when I did Interfish, that was kind of the height of the creation wars. And I would go south and talk. And I would talk to people and I was really focused on the kids. discovery stories for the kids because they're the future in many ways. And so, when you talk to kids, it can be a little easier than talking to adults. I was in Louisiana last week talking about this. Yeah, the kids were all over it. It was just amazing, And so I don't know, I don't have a clear answer to that. My own personal feeling is to communicate more the aesthetics as humans. That's kind of part of the book. I end on an aesthetic note, not a scientific note. And that was on.
See how kids relate to you. They like dinosaurs.
Oh, and they love fish with big teeth and but then I show them a fish with arms. That really messes with them. So.
Will you close the evening for us?
Yes. So first off, thank you for your time. My name is Ellingson King. I don't go to Columbia, but I work in sustainability. And my question is, as an accomplished scientist and best-selling author who has found his authentic voice, can you speak to the role, if any, that journaling may have played in, making or helping you cultivate your voice, or if there are any other habits that kind of help you? Yeah.
Yeah, journaling's huge. So, there are two things that I think really continue to play a role in my life in a very big way. I'm an avid reader, both fiction and nonfiction. So reading great writers is the best way to improve your own writing. Read, read, read. And the other is write. Yeah, I write a lot. And particularly when I have a project like this, I'll write a lot around the edges on it, before I dive in. And so journaling is really important, being connected with yourself. You notice I've been talking about authenticity and telling stories that matter, and we're connecting to empathy. That means knowing yourself. For the kind of writing I do, I'm not a journalist where, I'm going to different topics each week. That's a whole nother gig. But I'm talking about something that's precious to me. And so connecting with yourself is really important. So reading and journaling are continuous things. My journal's from being in the Arctic. I'll journal when I'm up in the tent, and recording my experiences. And in fact, the final vignette in the book was in my first year journal from 1988. And I was going through, it's this experience with the train. And I was going through my notes, and it was one of the first things I wrote when I was in the Arctic in 1988 in my journal. And it meant a lot to me, over 30 years ago. It meant even more now when I was finishing the book. So journaling is important.
So on that note, first, let me thank you for your openness, for your time, and wish you wonderful luck with the new book, which Neil will be here to sign immediately after we fold the Q&A. But I'd also like to remind folks that we have another event connected to the class. We're having Vernon Loeb, who is the publisher and the editor-in-chief of Inside Climate News, a news service that covers these issues, come to class on, what is the exact date? March 12th. And you're welcome to come to another open session of the class to meet Vernon Loeb and talk about what he does in setting up this news service that didn't exist before and that's focused on many of the issues that you care about. So I thank you all for spending our first balmy evening in a long time indoors. And thank you for coming, and thank you for your good questions, all of you. And Neil will be here to talk to you individually and sign some books. And we hope to see you again at other events. So thank you so much, and thank you, Neil.